Temitayo Olugbade, and I'll be presenting our paper that got published in Tokai and was slated to be presented at CHI this year. And the title is How Can Affect Be Detected and Represented in Technological Support for Physical Rehabilitation? So affective computing studies that have been done up until this point, we did not see evidence to suggest that they fully cater to the requirements of chronic conditions. For example, we know that chronic conditions are long-term and so involve more complex affective experiences than you would have in acute illnesses, for example. Chronic conditions are also typically self-managed, whereas a lot of technology has been designed for use by the clinician rather than focusing on the patient. And related to that is that therapy in chronic conditions go beyond clinical settings. So it's important to think about mobile context rather than situated kind of therapy in clinical settings, for example. And we use chronic pain for a case study. Chronic pain is a chronic condition where pain persists in the absence of tissue damage, and this has been found to be related to dysfunction in the nervous system. People with chronic pain typically find everyday functioning challenging, and we know that emotional states and moods are barriers to engaging in the activities that they value. So we know this from quantitative studies that have been done in pain research. But quantitative studies, we know, only give us so much. They give us numbers and mathematical relationships, but then they don't give you deeper insight than qualitative, like that qualitative studies, for example, could give. We think, and that is the framing of the paper, we think that affective computing studies could be more valuable if you have, if you could call it a wedding of HCI and affective computing, where affective computing studies build from analysis and understanding of the particular requirements of the chronic condition for chronic pain in our own case. And in this paper, we not just building in that one way, but also actually having the outcomes of the affective computing studies feeding back into further exploration, deeper understanding of how such technologies could be used. And then that could also feed back to rebuilding or modifying the affective computing system. And you could have as many iterations as is needed. And in this paper, we only went about halfway through, where we did an HCI study to understand what was needed, and we used that as the basis for our affective computing study. And for the future work is that we have in sight, well, not directly in sight, but on a longer term, is then doing the other bits of the vision. And what HCI gives is opportunity to have qualitative insight into what are the barriers and needs in the chronic pain context of everyday functioning. And affective computing provides the opportunity to then explore automatic detection technology for that specific context. For the HCI study we did, we used data we already had. So we did secondary analysis, and the data was data with two perspectives. So with the perspective of the person with chronic pain, and also physiotherapists that had expertise in pain management. And in the next couple of slides, I will just take you through some of the findings we got around the themes that emerged. So one of the themes that emerged is that about the barriers, emotional barriers to everyday physical functioning for people with chronic pain. And it would probably not surprise you that having a bad pain day, so that is what a person with chronic pain would typically call a day where they had high levels of pain. Having a bad pain day, we found that to be a barrier to everyday functioning, because on a bad pain day, people would typically not want to do much or even anything at all. And flare-ups, which is about on exceptionally high levels of pain or extended days of high levels of pain, also got people with chronic pain quite discouraged about their progress, the progress they've been making in the management of their pain. What might surprise you is that a good pain day itself could actually be also a barrier. So on a bad pain day, they're likely to do very little, if anything at all. On a good pain day, they are likely to overdo, because they may think, oh, I haven't felt this good in a while, and there's all of this stuff I wanted to do, so I'm just going to do everything today because I don't know when next I will feel this good. And then that, what is more likely to follow is a bad pain day, because they have overused their muscles. And what physios would recommend is gradual increase in physical activity levels, rather than trying to just at once increase that level. And also that it is important to take breaks and have muscle stretches. Fear and anxiety about pain could also be a barrier. So we had a physio participant talking about how they had a patient, and they said the patient came in literally scared stiff, because and that meant that the participant the patient couldn't bend, couldn't do a full bend while standing. But when the physiotherapist got them to sit down and try the same movement while being seated, they were better able to do that. And so we could see how fear and anxiety could be a barrier to doing a movement that actually is biomechanically possible. Pain-related low mood was also found to be a barrier to everyday functioning. So on a day where they had a low mood, particularly when it's related to pain, the person might have different, might think about their pain differently. If they were in a good mode, then the same level of pain would affect them differently than on the day where they were in a low mood. The other thing we found was around, the other findings we found was around the theme of the need. So we know the barriers to everyday functioning, but what do people with chronic pain need to address these barriers? And I like to think of the central idea of being continuous monitoring. So on a bad pain day, they needed to stay active. So trying to be conscious about how the level of pain they had. So they needed to make sure that they were doing the right thing. So on a bad pain day, I need to remember that even though I'm not feeling so good, then I need to do a minimum that I've set for myself. And when I have flare-ups, I would need encouragement. So being able to seek encouragement and being conscious about seeking encouragement at such periods. And on a good pain day is the need to have helpful pacing of activity. For fear and anxiety about pain is the need to be aware about behavioral responses. So because when people are fearful or anxious, they would respond in a way that is not particularly helpful in addressing the challenge. So for example, a person who was trying to get up from a chair and they were scared about doing that movement, what they might do is twist to the side and place their two hands maybe on the right side of the chair, and use that to push up from the chair. And that really just makes the movements more challenging, but also could cause unnecessary pain in itself. And so it's being aware of that, and then reflecting about how the more helpful way they could do that same movement while they still had high levels of fear and anxiety. And when they have low moods, one of the participants did say that they found it helpful to be able to identify the trigger. So either being able to identifying it and avoiding the trigger, or when it was unavoidable, for example, a bad day at work, is knowing early how to make sure it didn't spoil the rest of the day. And physios also pointed to the need to address unhelpful beliefs that underlie the low mood, or that low mood itself could bring about. So for example, thinking that I have pain and that means I cannot have a life. And like one of our participants said, so one of the people with chronic pain, an individual knows best how they are feeling. Well, as the participant continues, but you can get all that babble in your head that can easily confuse the messages. And in addition to that, we know from the discussions or the analysis of the data we did itself, and also previous work, that for people with chronic pain, awareness does not come easily. So for example, even proprioceptive feedback is not as it is for healthy people. And so it is not trivial to continuously monitor. And also is the challenge that awareness needs to be steered in the right direction. So it's not just about having just awareness and reflection, but it has to be valuable approach, valuable direction. So for example, a person who pays attention to their level of pain, that is not a helpful thing to do, because it can lead to over attention to pain. And what physiotherapists would typically do in clinical sessions with a person with chronic pain is to get them to think about other possibly neutral sensations that are related to movement. So for example, in doing a stretch movement, thinking about the feeling of their muscles and how the tension in the muscles, so rather than pain itself. And also in reflection there is the tendency for people with chronic pain to unconsciously associate pain with movement, because they have pain anytime they move, because they have pain all the time, whereas this is not a helpful belief. And so it is important not just to be aware and to reflect, but to have it steered in the right direction. And also there's just the thing of the continuous self-monitoring, so checking this and that is just quite burdensome. It is very high cognitive load. And so we think there is a role for affective computing in this context. And so that was the basis of the affective computing study we then went on to do. And we used machine learning approach. One important thing also is that we use body movements as the modality for automatic detection. So in affective computing circles, the face is very well researched. But in the context of pain, body movement is particularly relevant. One, we know from pain behavior research that body movement is more expressive of pain experience than facial or vocal cues. And this is, if you think about it, it's kind of intuitive. So the experience that a person has while doing a movement, it makes sense that you are more likely to pick that up from the movements, so how the person is doing the movement, rather than, for example, a third-party modality like facial or vocal cues. Body movement also has the advantage in that it provides information about the strategy the person uses in dealing with the internal experience they have. So for example, going back to the example about the person trying to get up from a chair, so they had high levels of anxiety, and that got them to do the movement in a different way than a person would usually do. And so the way they did the movements allowed inference about what was going on internally for the person, but actually it is also valuable information to see actually how they do that, and this is something that physiotherapists would use and address in clinical settings. So it is important that body movement as a modality provides that information. And also there's just the practicality that in mobile settings, it is more practical, at least more practical than capturing the face. Using video, for example, is you can use wearable sensors to capture body movement. So we used data that we had available. So the data, the MOPAIN data set, which you see on the left, and the UB MOPAIN data set, which you see an overview of it on the right. And the data set consists of body movement sensors, wearable sensors, and also muscle activity sensors, EMG, that we placed on your back. So the body movement sensors were placed full body and the muscle activity sensors on the back. And for the MOPAIN data set, we used quite high fidelity sensors, but it meant that they were very expensive and also required a bit of bulky equipment. And we know that this is not practical to deploy in everyday physical setting of a patient. And that is why we explored more low-cost, very, very low-cost sensors and a fewer number of sensors for that matter, to try to understand how the performance we get, the machine learning performance we get using such kind of sensors. So the next couple of slides, I'll just take you through some of the results from our machine learning analysis. So we did analysis of characteristics of body movements that were informative in inferring pain and related emotional states. And we did such in-depth analysis because we wanted to better understand what sensors were necessary to be able to cut down the number of sensors as much as we could. But also just to contribute to pain behavior research, because a lot of studies in that field had been based on just behavior of pain itself, so the pain states, and not particularly around states related to pain, so states such as pain-related emotional distress, which would include low mood and anxiety. So we had a lot of interesting findings around the features, and I will not go into much details about all of them. You can read that in the paper. I just picked a couple that I thought were particularly interesting. So here on this slide is about head slump, head or shoulder slump. So in previous literature, and you probably know from experience also, that a person who is distressed is more likely to have head slump. And we expected this in our data set. And so we looked at the minimum head angles of people who were distressed versus those who were not distressed. And we actually found that those who were not distressed had significantly lower head angles than those who were distressed, which was totally opposite what we had expected. But actually, if you think about it, it's not so surprising. So when we did the analysis of the same head angles with respect to pain, we found that there was people with higher levels of pain were more likely to not move their neck much in, for example, a bend movement, so a full bend, trying to pick something up from the floor. And they were likely not to move their head much. And this is related to the rigidity in movements that you typically find in people with chronic pain. So this is something that is known, although we're the first to actually show that you find the same thing in the head that is not related to the primary pain location they had. So sorry, something I didn't make clear is that we focused on people with chronic low back pain, just because it's the most prevalent form of chronic pain. So the head was not the primary pain location for these participants, although they could have had pain in the head. And so the finding that we have here, that I'm showing on this slide, could just be due to that, the fact that people with chronic pain are more likely to be to not move their head a lot. So rather than giving some evidence of head slump. And when we further looked at how long the two groups, so the distressed and the not distressed, when we looked at how long they spent at the minimum head angle, we did find that those who were distressed spent significantly longer time at the minimum head angle compared to those who were not distressed. So which just supported what we thought. So what I showed you on the previous slide was data we got from the body movement sensors. And here is just an example of some finding we had based on muscle activity sensors. So on the image on the left, you see two lines, one black and one gray. And the black line is, so both lines are muscle activity data, but the black is for a person with chronic pain, whereas the gray is for a person without chronic pain. And what you see is that the line for the person with chronic pain is kind of flat. So basically no muscle activity all through the movement. And if you try to think about what is the person actually doing during that muscle activity data you have. So if you follow the red arrow for the person with chronic pain, even though they are meant to be doing a stretch movement, so as if trying to reach to pick a book from a bookshelf, for example, while standing, and you see that there is actually no back movement, even though they're actually meant to be stretching. Whereas for a person without chronic pain, you see that the back is actually bent. And this corresponds to the activation you see. So that was one pattern we did find for people with chronic pain, where there's flat muscle activity, which is just basically them not moving, perhaps due to fear or just pain itself. The other kind of pattern, one of the other kinds of pattern we found for a person with chronic pain is what you see now on the right. And again, there are two lines, the black and the gray. So the gray line is just the same from the left, and the black is a new, it's for a different person with chronic pain. And you see that now there is some activation in muscle activity, some activation of the muscle for this person with chronic pain. But where it is differentiated from the healthy pattern is at the end. So if you follow again the red arrow for the person with chronic pain, you see the magnification, and you compare that with the magnification on the right for the healthy pattern. And you see that for the healthy pattern, there is a drop at the end of the movement where they've finished, so they started from standing and then they reached forward and they went back to standing. And when they got back to standing, muscle activity dropped, which corresponds to, which is what you would expect, because they are no longer using the back muscles. But for a person with chronic pain, you don't really find that drop. And so this is one of the findings we had of significantly reduced or delayed relaxation in muscle for a person with chronic pain. So they finish the movements, but they still keep muscle tension, even when they no longer need that. So, so those were some of the interesting findings we had around characteristics of movements that were helpful to infer levels of pain and emotional distress. And here on this slide is results of automatic detection, and we had quite good results. So on the left, the cluster you see on the left is based on data from the expensive sensors, and on the right is based on data from the low-cost sensors. And if we focus on the yellow bars, so showing results for detection of levels of pain, we looked at 3 levels, and they are both better than if you just randomly guessed the level of pain, which would have been at 0.3 performance, so 0.3 F1 score. You can think of the F1 score in terms of accuracy. So the higher is between 0 and 1, and the higher the value, the better it is. And of course, as we would have expected, using the quite expensive sensors got better performance than using the cheaper sensors, but using the cheaper sensors was still much better than just random guess. And for emotional distress also, so we only looked at emotional distress for the expensive sensors, because when we use the cheaper sensors to collect data, we didn't have any participant that had emotional distress. So for emotional distress, we had only 2 levels, distressed or not distressed. And we see that that is also, we also got results that was better than just random guess of the distress level, which would have been a 0.5. So the bottom line, we think that we believe that our results show that there is opportunity for chronic pain, for affective computing technology in the context of physical rehabilitation for people with chronic pain. But we think that, we believe and we think our results show that it is not just about automatic detection, but it is designing such system around personalization of encouragement. So you could give encouragement at any time, but if you give it when it is not needed, that's just patronizing. If you don't give it when it's needed, then that is not at all helpful. And using affective computing technology for continuous monitoring allows the possibility of delivering encouragement when it is particularly needed. So for example, when you have bad pain days, when the person doesn't really want to do anything, or when you have extended bad pain days, when the person is likely to think, oh gosh, I'm back to this again. Am I going to get out of it this time around? And also when a person is distressed. So for example, when they have low mood. And it's not just about giving encouragement, saying something positive. No, we think that encouragement needs to be grounded in data. So for example, if the technology is capturing data about physical activity levels and emotional experience, then that data could then be used to show the participant that, oh, the time when you previously had this form of setback, you were able to get out of it. So using that as encouragement that the participants, the person is able to get out of the current setback. We think affective computing technology should also be designed around regulating awareness. So giving awareness when it is needed, rather than just awareness, constant awareness, which would not be valuable at all. So for example, providing awareness of physical activity on a good pain day, and also providing reminders about that the person on that day should take a break or have a stretch. So it's not just about detecting levels of pain and showing that to the user. That is not at all helpful. The technology could also provide awareness of unhelpful movement behavior. So for example, the person twisting to get up from the chair, to get them to then reflect on a more valuable way they could do that same movement. And that is the end of my talk. The qualitative analysis was done by Anisha, and the work was done during my PhD, and I was supervised by Nadia, Nikolai, and Amanda, who is now at UCLIC. She's a clinical psychologist with pain expertise. And if you've been at UCLIC as long enough, you would know Ain. He also contributed to the work. Thank you.